Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission is pretty straightforward. You give us your sources, we pull out the key insights. Basically, we're your shortcut to getting informed without feeling buried.
And today, we're diving into excerpts from a book called Careless People.
That's right. And our focus here is really just to cover what's in this material as faithfully as we can, giving you a clear picture of the author's experiences and what she observed.
Yeah, and these excerpts, they give a really compelling look behind the curtain at Facebook's early years, its evolution.
And it's all through the eyes of someone who worked in global public policy there.
Exactly. Which gives us this, unique perspective on the company's growth, the internal stuff, and its growing clout on the world stage.
Okay, so let's get into it. The author kicks things off pretty strongly, summing up her 7 years at Facebook by saying it started as a hopeful comedy and ended in darkness and regret.
Darkness and regret. Yeah, that's quite a statement. Sets the tone immediately, doesn't it?
It really does. It signals this whole shift in her perspective over time.
And she was right in the thick of it, advising top leaders, think Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, on dealing with governments all over the world.
So she saw it all.
Pretty much.
Oh.
And she highlights this stark contrast, between her early idealism about Facebook changing the world and what she saw later. The company, as she puts it, sucking up to authoritarian regimes like China's and casually misled the public.
Wow. And then there's that anecdote about Mark Zuckerberg on the private jet.
Oh, yeah, where he apparently has this moment of realization saying Facebook probably did put Donald Trump in the White House.
That's quite an admission or observation from the CEO himself.
It really makes you think about the power these platforms wield. And she follows it up with this analogy that kind of sticks with you.
The one about the teenagers.
Yeah. Comparing policy work there, not to some, grand Machiavellian plan, but more like watching a bunch of 14-year-olds who've been given superpowers and an ungodly amount of money.
It paints such a vivid picture, doesn't it? Immense power, maybe not always matched with foresight.
Precisely. It captures that feeling.
Now, even before she joined, she talks about this intense belief she had back in mid-2009.
Right, that Facebook was genuinely going to change the world.
She even admits it was hard to explain without sounding, well, utterly insane.
But you see her early insight there. She saw politics migrating online, saw Facebook becoming this central global hub, maybe even setting the rules.
It was almost like an evangelistic belief.
Totally.
Yeah.
She compares its potential impact to genetically modified crops, but maybe even more profound for, politics and people's lives.
So with that conviction, she decides she has to work there. But getting in wasn't easy.
No, she says the company kind of prided itself on being hard to reach.
She resorted to internet stalking.
Basically, yeah,
Yeah.
trying to find the right contacts. And initially, the people she found, the political staff, they were focused on practical stuff.
Like just teaching Congress how to use Facebook.
Exactly. Not quite the global political revolution she was imagining.
But then Martin Levine gets hired as VP of Global Public Policy in 2010. That seems like a key moment.
Absolutely. That signaled a more strategic approach from Facebook. The author gets excited, drafts this whole political manifesto.
Which she's told not to send.
Right. You see, this internal conflict she has, is this job realistic? But also, feeling like Facebook needs what she's offering.
It's fascinating. She felt she had to pitch the revolution to Facebook, not fight off competitors for Facebook.
Yeah, it speaks volumes about where the company was at that point.
Okay, so her first chats with Marn sound a bit unusual.
Uh-huh. The first call, they touch on China, media stuff, but Martin seems really focused on whether Mark should take credit for the Arab Spring.
Which the author flags as a potential issue for China.
Exactly. Showing some early strategic thinking there. If Facebook claims credit for revolutions, that's not going to play well in Beijing, right?
Makes sense. But then she doesn't hear back.
Nope. Radio silence. She almost gives up, then gets an email about communications job in Australia.
Not exactly the global policy role she wanted.
Not at all. But she cleverly uses those interviews to basically pitch the job she actually wants.
Resourceful.
Definitely. And then, boom, 3 months later, Marn calls her out of the blue, offers her the manager of global public policy role.
Finally.
But even then, Marn admits she's still not even sure this is a job.
Wow. That level of uncertainty really says something about how new this whole area was for them.
Totally. It was uncharted territory.
So she arrives at the D.C. office, and the description: exposed pipes, fake graffiti.
Yeah, very Silicon Valley startup comes to D.C. Utilitarian, maybe symbolically under construction.
And her first task, managing a visit from the Prime Minister of New Zealand.
John Key, yeah. And she just assumes Mark Zuckerberg will host him, head of state protocol.
But the Facebook team is surprised by that assumption.
Apparently, yes. It shows that clash of cultures, traditional diplomacy versus Facebook's way of doing things.
There's that anecdote, too, with Debbie Frost comparing her UN work on GMOs unfavorably to the excitement of Facebook.
Right? It kind of reveals this internal Facebook view, maybe a bit dismissive of other kinds of important global work.
And the meeting itself with Prime Minister Key sounds less about policy.
And more about his Facebook page and his friend Choppy's helicopter business.
Yeah.
Yeah, a bit surreal.
Then there's the German delegation, baffled by the office decor.
It just keeps reinforcing this image of a company still figuring out its place on the global stage.
But amidst all this, she's impressed by Marne Levine's work ethic.
Oh, definitely. Describes her as incredibly dedicated, relentless even, sets a demanding tone.
And despite the weirdness, the author initially felt positive.
Yeah, she mentions working with smart people, and this sense, early on at least, that Facebook was trying to do good.
We also see the first formal policy steps being taken.
Right, the first public community guidelines, the transparency report, Marne pushed for those,
Yeah.
and starting to figure out how to handle law enforcement data requests.
Foundational stuff.
Absolutely. But there were early clashes, too, like the organ donation feature.
Sheryl Sandberg championed that one, right?
Yeah, but the launch was scaled back. And Mark apparently overruled the author's communication plan with just a 4-word email.
Ouch. Shows who calls the shots.
Clearly.
Okay, fast forward a bit to April 2012. She gets this kind of strange assignment involving Javier Olivan.
Right. Basically, show Javi a good time at the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena.
The goal being to keep him at Facebook, especially with the IPO coming up.
Exactly. It really shows how crucial growth and the people driving it, like the growth team, were to the company's core, especially then. Retaining key talent was paramount.
She describes Javi as more street smart than Mark.
Yeah, and notes he saw Snapchat's potential early on. A different kind of intelligence, maybe more grounded.
The summit itself sounds a bit flat for Facebook. No reserved seats at the big dinner.
Yeah, suggests they weren't quite seen as the indispensable power they'd later become, still finding their diplomatic footing.
And the funny story about Javi thinking a salsa club was the place to find Hillary Clinton.
Adds a bit of color, but also hints at that slight unfamiliarity with the diplomatic scene.
But then the IPO happens, stock dips, and suddenly international growth becomes critical.
Massively important. And the author finds herself traveling constantly, being that first point of contact for many governments.
Her role really expands.
Hugely. But internal disagreements continue, like the resistance from Marne and Elliott about giving info to the Canadian Privacy Commissioner, shows a wariness of scrutiny.
Then comes Myanmar. Javi just tells her to go and sort it out.
Yeah, just like that. Talking about a complex situation being handed over with a vague mandate.
The description of the trip sounds intense. The empty highway trying to connect with Aung San Suu Kyi.
It really paints a picture of Facebook stepping into these incredibly complicated places, maybe without a full playbook. The formality of meeting the junta rep, the sheer exhaustion afterwards.
It shows the personal cost of that kind of work.
Definitely.
This brings us into the lean-in era. Sheryl Sandberg becomes a global figure.
Right. The book's launch definitely changed things internally. The author mentions feeling like a lean-in visual aide while pregnant in a meeting with Japan's PM Abe.
Though that meeting with Abe was actually productive on policy.
Surprisingly, yes. But then the incident with Angela Merkel declining a meeting with Sheryl and the internal fallout. It shows the sensitivity around these high-level interactions.
And the pressure sending a work email right before giving birth.
Intense. And the story about the baby being alone with a firefighter. It highlights the challenges of juggling that kind of demanding job with motherhood.
There's a real contrast, she points out, between the public authentic self message
and the internal reality where apparently he didn't talk much about kids, plus the irony of leaders limiting their own kids' screen time.
It suggests a bit of a disconnect.
A potential one, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Women's Day events sound a little, well, corporate feminist lead, perhaps.
Summer 2014, she's told to go to a conference in Colombia focused on internet.org, even with a new baby.
Yeah. Internet.org was Mark's big push. Launched the year before, drones, satellites, lasers connecting billions, huge vision.
This trip seems to be where she starts interacting more directly with Mark.
Right. She's setting up meetings for him with leaders in Indonesia, Japan, Korea. And notes, Sheryl wasn't thrilled about Mark doing these leader meetings outside purely business contexts. hints at internal dynamics.
And the situation in Korea sounds alarming, the investigation, talking about sending a body to test the waters for an arrest.
Yeah, that's pretty concerning. Suggests a really aggressive stance towards regulation, maybe prioritizing expansion over compliance or employee safety.
The private jet travel anecdotes add some color, too.
Definitely. Casual clothes, awkward swimming with Mark. It's this strange bubble they operated in.
And she starts questioning the growth tactics, asking if they were winning that way.
You see that ethical unease growing. Then the chaotic Indonesia trip with the unplanned Blue Sukan walk with President-elect Widodo.
Where she gets separated from Mark's security. Sounds stressful.
Extremely. But it's also during this trip, Mark friends her on Facebook. A smunk thing, but symbolic.
Their conversations shift to wealth, tuna, Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, and crucially, he starts getting interested in foreign elections, political systems. Suggests his focus is widening.
Perhaps hinting at bigger ambitions.
Maybe. Which leads into the whole China question. Mark sees it as the last major project.
But the author doesn't think he's fully grappling with the moral side.
That's her perspective.
Yeah.
She doubts they'll get in anyway, given the clash with the Communist Party's goals. Meanwhile, Vaughn is pushing hard on the China initiative.
He seems quite determined.
Relentless is how she portrays him. Even when Instagram is suddenly threatened with blocking, his focus is on getting a physical presence, partnerships.
And the author mentions explaining Nuremberg principles to him.
Yeah, calls that a red flag. A chilling moment suggesting very different ethical viewpoints.
Then there's a big leadership change. Marn leaves policy, Joel Kaplan takes over.
And Kaplan comes from a Republican background, close to Cheryl. The focus shifts, becomes more U.S.-centric.
Those intertwined personal and professional ties seem important.
A recurring theme, yeah. And Kaplan changes the content removal policy, prioritizing credible threats of blocking the service or risks to employees over maybe broader content issues.
So the bar for taking down content gets higher unless there's a direct threat to Facebook's operations or staff.
That seems to be the implication.
Meanwhile, global challenges keep mounting. The event with President Santos in Colombia to promote Internet.org
becomes chaotic with Mark arriving late. Logistics nightmare.
And the author takes her baby to Davos.
Which gets mixed reactions internally. Davos itself sounds exhausting, constant social calculation. And it becomes this annual pressure point for Facebook's global issues.
And then the conversations about Irish tax arrangements.
Yeah, the double Irish. She feels uncomfortable, like she's part of some backroom deal to avoid taxes.
Adds another layer of ethical discomfort, plus the personal struggle of juggling work and motherhood there.
And topped off by having to find Mark's lost boots late at night. It's almost farcical.
After Davos, under Joel, Facebook ramps up investment in political campaigns globally.
Right, moving from platform provider to active participant, which worried the author about neutrality.
At the same time, Internet.org is stalling.
Despite Mark's focus, yeah. He gets bumped from a panel with Obama in Panama. You sense his view of Facebook's importance is growing, maybe faster than reality sometimes.
His priorities become China and Internet.org. He gives a speech at the UN.
Gets good press, but then has that tense lunch with Merkel about anti-refugee posts in Germany.
So, public success, private friction.
Exactly. And the launch of his UN video at the Global Citizen Festival is described as embarrassing, chaotic. The suggested Facebook post with the white engineer and refugees.
Sounds incredibly tone-deaf.
Yeah. And then they realize his big UN announcement about Wi-Fi for refugee camps. There's no actual plan behind it.
Wow. Just an announcement.
Apparently,
Yeah.
Mark starts using Street Fighter tactics for Internet.org, creating an enemies list. A real shift in approach.
The author seems increasingly disillusioned.
Starts focusing on internal objections, maybe dragging her feet on things she disagrees with. The India war room for free basics, the manipulative ad campaigns there.
It sounds like immense pressure to win in India.
Totally. And then the panic when they think they've messed up the comment submissions to the Indian regulator, TRAI, fear of getting fired.
The private jet dynamics continue to be weird too. Cheryl wanting her to share a bed.
Leads to that mortifying story about snoring and sleeping in a makeshift tent on a previous flight. Just adds to the surreal, pressured environment.
And she's dealing with U.S. citizenship issues too.
Yeah, residency requirements clashing with all the travel. Then comes the internal recognition. We're in shit with governments all around the world.
Time to tell the board.
Right. The author gets tasked with writing the board presentation, asking for huge resources for the policy team.
How did the board meeting go?
Surprisingly casual, she says. Mark completely in control. But then Mark's own Facebook post about WhatsApp being blocked in Brazil backfires.
And contributes to a Facebook exec being arrested there.
That's the connection she draws. It really highlights the real-world consequences and her growing concern about Mark's worldview growth seemingly trumping human cost.
This period sounds incredibly difficult personally, too, with her health crisis.
Yeah, the Zika scare during pregnancy, the doctor being dismissive, then the serious complications after birth, ending up in the ICU. Terrifying.
And Joel Kaplan pressuring her to work while on maternity leave and sick.
Really tough. And doing her performance review while she's on leave seems incredibly insensitive.
Then, at a strategy meeting in Delhi, she raises the alarm about Facebook being weaponized, like by Duterte in the Philippines.
But leadership dismisses it. Joel focuses on the money controversial political content brings in. That's her account. A real clash of priorities.
After Trump's election, there's a meeting about employee feelings.
Joel rationalizes the result. Elliot and Mark deny Facebook played a significant role. A pattern of deflection, perhaps.
It seems like a refusal to grapple with their impact.
That's the sense you get from her writing.
Okay, so she finally gets Mark to this meeting of presidents and prime ministers in Peru.
Yes, but even that starts with chaos. Mark forgets his passport.
Seriously.
Apparently so. Causes delays, frustration. He's preoccupied with the election results. Elliot's still trying to talk him through the denial.
And the planned spontaneous meeting with Xi Jinping gets derailed.
By a massive Chinese security detail showing up unexpectedly. Mark seems disinterested in briefings, back to his more detached style.
Quite a change from the PM Key meeting years earlier.
Huge difference in his attitude, his global standing. Then there's that tense board game moment.
Where Mark concedes she made a fair point about her accusations.
A rare crack in the facade, maybe. He also muses about buying or creating a news organization.
Which adds to the author's theory.
That Mark was seriously considering a presidential run around this time. The Rosebud comment, the land stuff in Hawaii, the stock changes. She lays out the evidence.
And on top of all this, she gets diagnosed with Lynch syndrome.
Making health insurance absolutely critical. Just immense personal pressure.
Flying back from Davos after Trump's inauguration, her husband's tracking her trips. The toll is clear.
Yeah. And the discovery of that WhatsApp group, where Cheryl's own advisors are complaining about her.
Shows cracks, even in the inner circle. Cheryl's focus on Melania Trump's clothes, her silence on the Women's March.
Raises questions about priorities and public versus private personas. Then the secret feminist fight club group among female employees.
Discussing harassment, systemic issues.
Exactly. The author shares her own negative experiences with Joel, Elliot's dismissive response. She tries to leverage a potential FCPA issue to address Joel's conduct.
And he retaliates by cutting her job in half, but still making her work on China.
It sounds like a toxic situation, frankly. Being forced under the China initiative despite her objections feels like punishment for dissent.
And the details of that China deal sound really concerning.
Storing user data locally, complying with censorship, a huge contrast to how they resisted requests from democratic governments, even the U.S.
It seems like a double standard driven by market access.
That's the strong implication. Secretly launching apps there, Vaughn dismissing legal and ethical worries. It paints a picture of pushing boundaries.
And firing the researcher in Australia, the debate about targeting ads based on emotions.
More signs of internal conflict and maybe ethical compromises. Mark's Q&As sound tone-deaf. Diversity efforts perceived as performative.
Leadership seems defensive, calling criticism a witch hunt.
Which just widened the gap between defenders and critics inside the company, and the awareness that the platform was designed to be addictive.
Exploiting user vulnerabilities, that's a heavy charge.
It is. And the story of the contractor having a seizure and being largely ignored suggests a shift in the workplace culture itself toward something less caring.
Then Myanmar becomes this horrifying case study.
Lethal carelessness is how she puts it. Failure to deal with hate speech against the Rohingya.
Warnings going back to 2014 being ignored.
Yeah. Content teams overwhelmed or maybe hamstrung by policy debates about what technically counts as hate speech, even as violence erupted, and the failure to implement the Burmese language font properly.
Which hindered moderation efforts.
Massively. Her pleas were ignored, she says, while resources flowed to the China censorship tools. A stark contrast in priorities.
Even after the election, the hate speech continued. Leadership indifferent.
That's the picture she paints. A real disconnect from the on-the-ground reality and the platform's role in fueling violence.
Her final interactions sound awful. Joel's behavior at the offsite.
Demeaning, she says. Confronting Elliot about it leads nowhere.
And then getting attacked by wasps.
Yeah, the symbolism isn't lost. Feeling overwhelmed, unsupported, like her husband driving away in that moment. Her dark humor about it not being the worst part of her day says everything about the stress she was under, declining health, the cumulative toll.
Leading to her decision to leave.
It felt inevitable reading her account. The ethical compromises, the toxic environment, it all added up.
And her final thought, comparing it to AI development outpacing ethics.
A powerful warning. Powerful tech needs powerful ethics, or the potential for harm is huge.
So wrapping up this deep dive on careless people, we've really traced this journey from, well, hopeful comedy to darkness and regret, as the author puts it.
Yeah. Faithfully exploring her account reveals these recurring themes.
Hmm.
The sheer difficulty of managing explosive global growth, that constant tension between business goals and ethical responsibility.
And the human impact of decisions made at the very top of these incredibly powerful companies.
Definitely. Her story, as presented in these sources, really forces you to think about the accountability of these platforms and their role in society.
It leaves you wondering about the future of social media and maybe reflecting on our own relationship with it.
Food for thought, for sure.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.